Welcome back to Wrestling Apocalypse, the channel that never sleeps when wrestling is giving us moments worth staying awake for. If you're new here, hit that subscribe button right now, because if you miss what we're about to break down today, you are genuinely going to feel left out when the entire wrestling world is talking about nothing else. And trust me, the entire wrestling world is talking about nothing else right now. Gunther, the Ring General. The man who carried the Intercontinental Championship for a record-shattering reign that made every single person on the Raw roster nervous just walking past him in the hallway. This is not a man who exists in professional wrestling. He is professional wrestling. When Gunther steps into that ring, something primal happens in the atmosphere. The noise changes. The energy shifts. Even the most casual fan, someone who only watches wrestling when they happen to flip past it on the television, will stop channel surfing when Gunther appears because there is something ancient and undeniable about his presence. He carries himself like a warrior king who has never once questioned his right to rule, because why would he? Nobody has ever given him a real reason to doubt himself. The chops alone deserve their own documentary. We could spend an entire video just talking about the sound of Gunther's chops, the thunderclap that echoes through an arena and makes 20,000 people simultaneously wince and gasp and roar with a mixture of horror and excitement. Opponents have described the experience of receiving one of those chops as similar to being struck by a large piece of industrial machinery. Their chests turn red immediately, then purple, then they wear that bruise for weeks like a badge of honor that they earned in battle against the greatest technical striker in the business today. But Gunther is not just a physical specimen, though he absolutely is that in the most impressive way. Gunther is a psychologist. He reads opponents, studies them, breaks them down piece by piece until he understands exactly which button to push to make them crack. He's methodical, calculated, patient in a way that almost seems cruel when you're the person he's being patient with, because you know the storm is coming and you can see it gathering on the horizon and there is absolutely nothing you can do to stop it. Now enter Oba Femi. If Gunther is the irresistible force of old-school European wrestling royalty, then Oba Femi is what happens when the next generation refuses to acknowledge the word impossible. This young man, and I want you to really sit with the word young for a moment because his age makes everything he's accomplished even more staggering. This young man is built like something that should only exist in a comic book. 6'4", 285 pounds of what can only be described as sculpted menace. When Oba Femi walks into a room, people move. Not because they're being polite, but because their survival instincts kick in automatically. His rise through NXT was one of those rare stories that even people who don't follow developmental wrestling found themselves paying attention to. He didn't just win championships down in NXT, he claimed them, like a conqueror planting a flag in territory that rightfully belonged to him. His athleticism is the kind that makes fellow wrestlers, people who are themselves extraordinary athletes, stop what they're doing and watch with genuine awe. The combination of his raw power and his developing technical skills creates something genuinely special. Something that feels like watching the early chapters of a career that will eventually be recognized as one of the greatest in wrestling history. But here's the thing about Oba Femi that casual fans might not fully appreciate yet: he doesn't just want to be great. He wants to be recognized as great. There's a hunger in him that goes beyond athletic competition, a deep, burning need to prove himself against the very best, to measure himself against the established hierarchy and come out on top. He's not interested in climbing the ladder rung by rung, proving himself against mid-card opponents while he waits patiently for his moment. Oba Femi looks at the top of the mountain and he sees a shortcut, and that shortcut runs directly through whoever happens to be standing at the summit. When the possibility of Gunther versus Oba Femi started being discussed in wrestling circles, the reaction was immediate and visceral. Fans who had been watching wrestling for 30 years started making comparisons to historic collision courses, the kind of dream matches that only come together once in a generation. Old versus new. Established dominance versus rising potential. The Ring General versus the force of nature. The matchup had everything you could possibly want from a high-stakes confrontation, and the anticipation was almost unbearable. The weeks leading up to Monday's Raw were filled with verbal sparring, and this is where the story really started to come alive. Because Gunther doesn't trash talk the way most wrestlers do. He doesn't scream and point and make wild promises about what he's going to do. He speaks with a cold, measured authority that is somehow more intimidating than any amount of theatrical ranting. During one of the contract segments that WWE filmed in the weeks prior, Gunther looked directly at Oba Femi across a table and said something that was quietly devastating in its confidence. "You are impressive," Gunther told him, and the way he said it made impressive sound like an insult rather than a compliment. But impressive is not excellence. Impressive fades. Excellence is permanent. And when we step into that ring together, you will learn the difference between those two things in a way that you will never forget, no matter how long you live or how many matches you compete in after this." The room was silent for a beat after that. And then Oba Femi smiled, and that smile was somehow even more chilling than Gunther's words, because it was the smile of a young man who wasn't frightened or rattled or even particularly affected by anything the ring general had just said. It was the smile of someone who genuinely believes, at a cellular level, that he is going to win. "I've heard about legends my whole life," Oba Femi responded, his deep voice filling the space with its own particular authority. "I've studied them, I've respected them, and then I've surpassed them. You're next." The wrestling world lost its collective mind. So that's the fuel that was sitting in the tank when Monday Night Raw rolled around. The entire show was building toward the final segment, toward the collision that everyone in that arena and everyone watching at home had been anticipating for weeks. And WWE did something smart with the pacing of the evening. They didn't try to distract you from what was coming. They didn't oversell it with constant interruptions and hyped packages every 10 minutes. They just kept the energy moving, kept delivering quality programming throughout the evening, and let the anticipation build naturally, organically, like a wave that starts small in the distance but grows more enormous with every passing moment as it rolls toward shore. Throughout the night, cameras caught glimpses of both men backstage. Gunther, warming up in his locker room with the focus and intensity of a surgeon preparing for a complex operation. His team around him, everyone silent because they know better than to break his concentration. He was shadowboxing with purpose, working combinations that had been designed specifically for the opponent he was about to face, his eyes carrying that particular cold fire that only appears when Gunther is truly, completely locked in. Oba Femi, meanwhile, was in a different headspace entirely. You could see it in the footage. Where Gunther was focused inward, Femi was outward-facing, already feeling the energy of the crowd, already absorbing the electricity of the building. He was doing dynamic stretching, throwing out power moves against a practice dummy with such force that the training staff had to keep repositioning the equipment. At one point, one of the crew members who works with him leaned over and said something in his ear, and whatever it was made Femi straighten up to his full height and let out a slow exhale that was equal parts excitement and absolute readiness. This man was ready. He had been ready for a long time. The final match of the evening before the main event closed out, and then the arena went dark in that particular way that tells you something special is about to begin. Not the darkness of a technical glitch or a planned entrance gimmick, but the darkness of theater, of deliberate anticipation, of the show telling you to pay attention because what comes next deserves your full, undivided focus. And then Gunther's music hit. Now, I've tried to describe this moment to people who weren't watching, and every time I do it I feel like I'm failing to capture the genuine majesty of it. The music itself is commanding, but it's the reaction it produces that tells the real story. The crowd is loud during a Gunther entrance. Not necessarily universally cheering, because Gunther occupies that fascinating space where his excellence has transcended simple hero and villain dynamics. People cheer him because they respect him, they boo him because he represents the crushing inevitability of a man who will not allow you to defeat him, and somehow both of those reactions happening simultaneously create this wall of sound that is uniquely Gunther's. He walked to the ring at his pace. Not slow, exactly, but deliberately unhurried, because Gunther has never once in his career behaved as though he owes anyone a single thing, including speed. He climbed the ring steps, stepped through the ropes, and stood in the center of that ring with his arms slightly away from his body, his chest out, his eyes scanning the crowd with that expression that somehow communicates both complete disdain and complete focus at the same time. The crowd was buzzing, the anticipation almost painful, because they knew what was coming next. When Oba Femi's music hit, the reaction was different but equally overwhelming. This was the roar of excitement, of the crowd seeing the future walking toward them and being thrilled by the prospect of what it might represent. Femi emerged from the back looking like an absolute monster in the best possible way, his physical presence somehow even more imposing against the backdrop of the arena's production than it is in the backstage footage. He stopped at the top of the ramp, stared down at the ring where Gunther was already waiting, and the two men simply looked at each other across the distance for a long moment that felt like the entire wrestling world pausing to take a breath. Femi made his way down the ramp without taking his eyes off Gunther, and Gunther never looked away either. The commentary team had gone comparatively quiet, letting the moment breathe, understanding that sometimes the best thing you can do is shut up and let greatness happen without narrating it to death. Femi stepped through the ropes and the two men were finally in the same ring together, standing maybe 8 feet apart, two mountains of athletic humanity staring each other down, and the crowd's volume went up another notch because they could feel it, that unmistakable electricity that only genuine collision produces. The referee called for the bell, and wrestling history stepped forward. The opening minutes were a tactical chess match that had the entire arena completely riveted. Both men circled each other slowly, measuring, testing, neither willing to commit to an opening move before they'd assessed the other's intentions. Gunther feinted a collar and elbow tie-up and Femi didn't bite, actually smiling slightly at the attempted deception. Femi shot for a tie-up of his own and Gunther slipped to the side with footwork that belied his size, creating an angle that left Femi momentarily exposed. But only momentarily, because Femi recovered with an agility that drew genuine surprised noises from the crowd. They finally locked up in the center of the ring, and the collision of those two bodies was audible. It sounded like two vehicles meeting at moderate speed, a deep thud that resonated through the arena's PA system. For a moment, neither man moved. They were pressed against each other in a deadlock, evenly matched for pure strength in a way that visibly surprised both of them. You could see it in Gunther's eyes, a flicker of something that wasn't quite concerned but was perhaps the tiniest, most begrudging acknowledgement that this young man might be every bit as powerful as advertised. Femi got the leverage first, driving Gunther backward toward the ropes. The ring general hit the ropes and used the rebound to break the hold, and then everything accelerated. Gunther went immediately to the chops. Of course he did, because the chop is his opening statement, his business card, his way of telling an opponent exactly who they're dealing with. The first one caught Femi across the chest and the sound of it made the front row recoil. A woman in the third row covered her mouth with her hands. A man in a Gunther shirt, someone who had clearly seen this many times before, still looked like he felt sympathetic pain on Femi's behalf. But here's the thing that made this moment so extraordinary, so different from what we'd seen in nearly every other Gunther match in recent memory. Oba Femi took that chop, staggered back one step, and then looked at Gunther with an expression that was equal parts pain and fury and something like excitement. Like the chop had woken something up inside him rather than broken something down. He answered with a clothesline that connected with such force that Gunther was taken completely off his feet. The ring general, who is not a small man by any definition of the word, went airborne and came crashing down to the mat with a crash that echoed through the arena. The crowd erupted. The commentary team erupted. Everyone in that building understood immediately that they were watching something genuinely different, a match where the usual rules about Gunther's dominance were not necessarily going to apply. What followed was 15 minutes of the most brutally compelling wrestling that Monday Night Raw has produced all year. Let me walk you through the highlights, because every single exchange deserves to be commemorated. Gunther, after recovering from that initial clothesline with the resilience that defines his character, went back to the body. He's too smart and too experienced to abandon his fundamental strategy just because his opponent showed early power. Instead, he adapted, targeting Femi's legs with deliberate precision, looking to slow down those explosive athletic tools. He caught a kick attempt from Femi, twisted with expert technique, and sent the younger man spinning to the mat, immediately pouncing to apply a submission hold that was so technically precise that the commentary team spent 90 seconds just describing the anatomical mechanics of what was happening to Femi's knee. Femi, to his enormous credit, didn't panic. Young wrestlers in pain during a championship-caliber match have a tendency to rush their escape attempts, to muscle out of holds with raw power and end up making things worse. Femi stayed composed, worked methodically to create space, and when he finally found the right angle, he pressed his free foot against Gunther's hip and pushed with leg strength so extraordinary that the ring general was physically displaced from his position despite his best technical efforts to maintain it. The crowd was going absolutely crazy, chanting for both men at different points, the noise shifting and swelling with every exchange like an audible reflection of the match's momentum swings. A group of Oba Femi fans in the upper deck had brought a homemade banner that read "The future is now," and they were waving it with such enthusiasm that you could spot it clearly on the television broadcast. Meanwhile, the traditional Gunther contingent at ringside was on their feet for virtually the entire match, because even they, even the most devoted ring general loyalists, couldn't help but be thrilled by what they were witnessing. Halfway through the match, things shifted into a higher gear that genuinely made it difficult to breathe. Femi had been building momentum through a sequence of power moves that were simply stunning in their execution. He hit a delayed vertical suplex on Gunther that lasted an absurd amount of time, holding 260+ pounds of ring general completely inverted for what felt like forever before finally dropping him to the mat, and the crowd counted every second of it out loud like they were witnessing something almost impossibly athletic, which they were. But Gunther is too experienced to simply absorb punishment without responding, and his response, when it came, was almost legendary in its execution. Femi charged at him with a spear attempt that had been building up as a potential finishing sequence, telegraphed just slightly by the way he dropped his shoulder on the approach. Gunther read it with the sixth sense of a man who has been in the ring for his entire adult life, sidestepped at the absolute last possible instant, caught Femi's arm as he passed, and transitioned into a sleeper hold that was applied with such perfect technique that the entire arena held its breath. This was the moment the match could have ended. The sleeper is one of Gunther's most effective finishing tools, and he had it locked in deep, his weight pressing down on Femi, his technique designed to minimize oxygen and blood flow with maximum efficiency. Femi's arms were flailing, searching for the ropes, finding nothing. His face was turning red. His movements were slowing. The referee was checking for loss of consciousness, that arm raise test that is one of wrestling's most dramatic devices. First arm drop. The crowd gasped. Second arm drop. People were standing up in their seats all over that arena. The arm came up for the third time, and Oba Femi refused. His hand shot out and stayed up, trembling with effort, and the building responded with a noise that I can only describe as a roar of pure primal emotion. He was fighting through it. He was refusing to go out. And then, in a display of strength that will genuinely be talked about for years, Femi gathered himself, planted his feet, and with what appeared to be sheer force of will backed Gunther into the corner, slamming the ring general into the turnbuckles hard enough to break the hold and leave both men breathing hard and assessing each other from opposite corners of the ring. The crowd was absolutely delirious. And then, with both men near their physical limits, with the match at its absolute peak of drama and intensity, everything changed in a way that nobody in that arena, nobody at home, nobody in the wrestling media or fan community could have predicted. The lights went out. Not a flickering, not a partial dimming, complete and total darkness throughout the entire arena. 12,000 people went from maximum volume to a confused, slightly anxious murmur in about 3 seconds flat. The commentary team was saying nothing, because they didn't know what to say. The referee in the ring was looking around, trying to understand what was happening. And then, when the lights came back on 10 seconds later, there were 3 additional figures in the ring. 3 men in matching black tactical gear, their faces covered, standing between Gunther and Oba Femi with the calm, organized precision of people who had planned this moment extensively and executed it without a single hitch. The crowd's confusion turned immediately to booing, massive, furious booing from every section of the arena, because nobody likes their main event moment interrupted by outside interference, no matter who your loyalties lie with. Gunther's reaction was to immediately step forward, because of course it was, because Gunther doesn't back down from anything or anyone. He grabbed the nearest intruder by the collar with both hands and drove him into the corner with controlled aggression, demanding to know what was happening with the particular authority of a man who has never once in his life accepted that rules don't apply to him. Oba Femi's reaction was equally immediate and equally committed. He caught one of the other figures with a clothesline so devastating that it sent the man half out of the ring, hanging over the middle rope with his feet kicking ineffectually at the air. But here's where total chaos truly began, and here's why this is the moment everyone is talking about this morning. The third figure, the one who had positioned himself strategically while his partners absorbed the initial responses from both Gunther and Femi, reached into his vest and produced something that made the crowd's booing reach a genuinely deafening level, a wireless microphone. He pulled back his hood to reveal a face that had been absent from WWE programming for 11 months. A face that prompted several different sections of the crowd to react in dramatically different ways, some screaming in excitement, some in outrage, some in genuine disbelief. A face belonging to someone who had left on complicated terms, whose return had been speculated about but never confirmed, whose unfinished business with both the ring general and the emerging next generation of WWE talent had been left hanging in the air like an unanswered question for nearly a year. I'm deliberately not naming him in this video, and there's a reason for that, which I'll explain in just a moment. What I will tell you is that he raised that microphone and delivered a speech that was perfectly crafted for maximum psychological impact, addressing both Gunther and Oba Femi simultaneously while the arena processed what it was seeing. Neither of you, he said, his voice carrying over the noise with practiced ease, have any idea what's coming. Both of you have been so focused on each other that you've completely ignored the storm that's been building right behind you. And now the storm is here. Gunther, to absolutely nobody's surprise, dropped the man he was holding against the corner, turned to face the speaker, and his expression was one of the most interesting I've ever seen on the ring general's face. Not anger, not confusion, but something almost like recognition, like someone seeing the confirmation of a suspicion they'd carried for a long time. Oba Femi stood at the other side of the ring, his massive chest heaving with exertion from the match, looking at this mystery speaker with those intense eyes that miss nothing. And then both men, independently and simultaneously, turned to look at each other across the width of that ring. What happened next was one of those organic, unscripted feeling wrestling moments that the industry lives for and rarely achieves. Gunther and Oba Femi, rivals who had been trying to destroy each other for the past 20 minutes, locked eyes across the chaos. An entire conversation happened in that look, volumes of mutual respect and mutual threat assessment, and a shared recognition that the variables in this equation had just changed dramatically. And then they both turned toward the mystery speaker and his two associates, and the body language shift was unmistakable. The crowd read it before it happened, and the noise level went nuclear. 3,000 people on the floor level were on their feet. People in suites were pressing against the glass. Everyone understood what was about to happen a half second before it did, and that half second of anticipation was absolutely incredible. Gunther and Oba Femi charged the mystery intruders simultaneously from opposite sides of the ring. Total chaos. Absolute beautiful, wonderful, completely out of control wrestling chaos. The three intruders scattered, two of them bailing out of the ring entirely and sprinting toward the crowd barrier as Gunther and Femi converged on the center. The mystery speaker himself caught a chop from Gunther that sent him spinning and then walked directly into Oba Femi, who grabbed him, lifted him, and held him aloft for a moment before Gunther very deliberately tapped Femi on the shoulder, their eyes meeting again, and Femi deposited the man unceremoniously over the top rope to the floor below. The crowd was in complete euphoria. This was not the ending anyone had predicted. This was better than the ending anyone had predicted. And then, standing in that ring together, surrounded by the wreckage of interrupted chaos, Gunther and Oba Femi faced each other one final time. The referee, who had long since lost any meaningful control of the situation, was standing in the corner trying to figure out what to put on his incident report. The crowd was chanting, first for one man, then for the other, then for both of them together in a split chant that perfectly captured the impossible complexity of rooting in a moment like this. Gunther, in a gesture that felt enormously significant coming from a man who guards his respect like a precious resource, extended his hand. The arena held its breath. Oba Femi looked at the hand, looked at Gunther's face, took what felt like a very long time to process what was being offered and what accepting it would mean, and then he gripped it. A firm, brief, unsmiling handshake between two warriors who had just spent 20 minutes trying to break each other and had instead found themselves standing back to back against a common threat. Not a friendship, not a partnership, a recognition, a mutual acknowledgement that whatever happens between them, it will happen on their terms, not anyone else's. Raw went off the air with those two men standing in the ring, the crowd's reaction washing over them like a wave, and the screen cutting to black before anyone could interrupt or over-explain what we had all just witnessed. For a few minutes after that, nobody on social media knew quite what to say. The wrestling world, which typically has an opinion about everything within 30 seconds, was quiet for a moment, just processing. And then, like a dam bursting, the reactions came flooding in. Clips from the match spread across every platform. Still photographs of that handshake were shared thousands of times within an hour. Wrestling fans who had gone to bed before the main event were waking up to discover that they'd made a terrible mistake and were frantically searching for ways to watch what they'd missed. This was the moment. This was the match. This was the segment. And we were lucky enough to be watching. Raw closing in total chaos sounds like a headline that should come with a disclaimer or an apology, but I'm here to tell you that this particular chaos was the most satisfying, most perfectly earned, most dramatically satisfying chaos that professional wrestling has produced in recent memory. It reminded us that the best wrestling stories don't always end with clean resolutions and clear-cut winners. Sometimes they end with more questions than answers, with new layers of complexity added to existing rivalries, with the horizon looking even more exciting than it did when the night began. What does this mean for Gunther going forward? What does this mean for Oba Femi's trajectory? Who is the mystery speaker and what is he ultimately after? What is the nature of the organization he seems to be leading? And perhaps most intriguingly of all, what happens to the Gunther vs Oba Femi rivalry now that an outside threat has forced them into momentary alignment? Does that shared experience add another dimension to their conflict, or does it complicate it in ways that make the eventual payoff even more extraordinary? The wrestling world is buzzing with questions this morning, and that is precisely where good wrestling storytelling should leave you. Not satisfied, not resolved, but hungry, ravenous, absolutely desperate to tune in next week to see what happens next. That is what Gunther and Oba Femi gave us on Monday Night Raw. That is what that match, that chaos, that extraordinary closing segment represents. It's a reminder that professional wrestling, at its absolute best, is unlike anything else in entertainment. It's unpredictable and athletic and emotional and dramatic, and sometimes it's messy and chaotic, and all of those things together create something that grabs you by the heart and refuses to let go. And that's exactly what Wrestling Apocalypse is here to celebrate. These moments, these genuine electricity in a bottle moments that remind you why you watch, why you care, why you've been a fan for however many years you've been a fan. We're here for every chop, every power move, every tactical chess match, every shocking revelation and every moment of unexpected beauty that this sport produces. If this video gave you even half the excitement of watching the actual segment, then we've done our job. If you want to make sure you never miss our breakdowns of the biggest moments in wrestling, the subscribe button is right there and it's the easiest way to guarantee that you'll always be part of the conversation. Drop a comment and tell me what you thought of the Gunther vs Oba Femi main event, tell me who you think the mystery speaker is, tell me where you think this story goes from here, because your takes are half the fun of running this channel and I read every single one. Until next time, this is Wrestling Apocalypse. Stay loud, stay passionate, and never stop believing that the next great moment in wrestling is always just one bell ring away.